Welcome to 1916 News, a programme that will transport you back to the fateful week of the Easter Rising, undoubtedly a seminal moment in Ireland's history. Each day of the Rising is dramatised as a news broadcast, with events set out as chronologically as possible to give a sense of both the flurries of activity and also of the quiet tensions. We have gathered the stories from around the nation to give a true sense of the countrywide effort that was the Rising, despite the disastrous orders from Eoin MacNeill that hamstrung the rebellion before it could truly get underway. But I've gotten ahead of myself. We begin with the news of the arrest of Sir Roger Casement on Good Friday, the 21st of April, at Bannastrand in County Kerry.
This is your news on Easter Sunday 1916. Reports of the arrest of an Anglo-Irish diplomat over the weekend have been confirmed. Our Kerry correspondent Stacey O'Keefe has more.
Sir Roger Casement, a known anti-imperialist and Irish nationalist, was taken into custody by the RIC on Friday, having travelled from Germany by U-boat. It is believed that Sir Casement was planning on rendezvousing with a German cargo ship that had been disguised as a Norwegian vessel, the Odd. The ship has since been captured by the British Navy and found to be carrying a cargo of 20,000 Mosin Nagant's 1891 rifles, 10 machine guns and accompanying ammunition destined for the arming of Irish volunteer forces in Munster and Connaught. I have local volunteer Tom Mulligan with me, and he says that the cargo represents a fraction of the promised number.
Sure, we were promised as many arms as we could manage, and men besides. The Irish prisoners of war held in Germany, you know, the so-called Irish Brigade, were supposed to come with the U-boat too and act as officers to the volunteers here. It's a total mess. So how can we hold the Shannon without guns? And now we hear that our Commandant, Stack, has been arrested in connection with the whole debacle. He wasn't even going to make a move to rescue Casement. Orders were to wait. I hope Dublin knows what it's doing.
Thanks, Tom. Now back to you, Owen.
Thank you, Stacey. It appears raids on German officials in New York and the interception of a secret communique gave authorities the information they needed to move on the conspiracy. Since the capture, the Odd, being escorted into Cork Harbour, was scuttled off Don's Rock by Captain Carl Spindler to prevent his cargo falling into British hands. The captain and crew remain in custody. And staying in Kerry, 5 men were killed in a car crash over the weekend. The RIC have stated that the men were travelling through fog with their headlights off and drove off a pier, which has added to the suspicion that the deaths were somehow connected to the arrival of the Odd in Tralee Bay. Parades of Irish volunteers have been taking place around the country, in particular in Cork, where over 1,000 men have been seen out in force. On the scene in Cork is Connie Feely.
These men are marching miles to Bale-na-Blah and on to Macroom, are shopkeepers, butchers, tailors, your average man on the street, but they are also members of the Irish Volunteers and as such have engaged in this extraordinary trek across the Cork countryside. One of the marchers, Donal Deasy, says orders are to engage in manoeuvres and then to disperse. Donal?
Well, to be honest, we're hoping for a bit more than manoeuvres. Some of the lads were saying we should make a move, make a stand like. Well, we have to follow orders. Some think we're a bit radical, but we're not rebel, you know. So manoeuvres it is and then home.
And Donal, there seems to have been a number of confusing and contradicting orders from Dublin, from Eoin MacNeill's cryptic advert in the Sunday Independent newspaper earlier and orders delivered by the hands of the ladies of Cumann arriving here in Cork since Friday, all have been contradicting Sean McDermott's own dispatches, stating that all had been resolved and all was to go ahead, which was then followed by Padraig Pearse's note that everything is off for the present. Donal, many are laying blame for the confusion at the door of the Irish volunteer leadership. Do you think, as many are saying, that now the Irish volunteers have joined forces with the more military-minded IRB and Connolly's even more radical Irish Citizen Army, that strife and hidden plans are almost a certainty?
It's been well known in Cork for a long time that the leadership of the GHQ is split. I can't imagine the IRB and ICA share all their thoughts and plans with MacNeill, and Hobson's already in their bad graces because of siding with the Home Rulers before they split. Though they all want the same thing, an independent Ireland, their views on how to get there are very different. You just have to hope the command don't end up falling all over themselves and spoiling everything for the rest of us. The others, the redheads, I mean, they still won't accept that it's too late for home rule. They had it in their grasp till Britain went and got itself involved in the European war. Now everything's on hold, and to be honest, I don't see them allowing us rule ourselves come the end of it. Sure, Redmond already had to settle for control of only 26 counties, and that's not an independent Ireland.
Thanks, Donal. Back to you, Owen.
Finally, in weather. Good news for anyone travelling to the Grand National at Ferryhouse tomorrow. It's going to be bright and sunny for the day. Unfortunately, away from the east coast, weather will vary from dull to downright dismal, with heavy rain showers expected, particularly in the south of the country. And that was your news for this Easter Sunday, the 23rd of April, 1916.
Roger Casement was stripped of his knighthood and executed for high treason on the 3rd of August 1916 for his part in the rising. He was not granted the military execution of a firing squad, but instead was hanged. And it was only in 1965 that his remains were finally repatriated to the Republic of Ireland. One of the first arrested during the rebellion, Kerry leader Austin Stack, had his death sentence commuted to penal service for life and was released under Lloyd George's general amnesty in 1917. During the Civil War, he went on hunger strike for 41 days before he was released in July 1924. His health never recovered and he died in April 1929. Our next report is from the morning of Easter Monday, where the first moves of the rebels are made in Dublin, and Pearse reads the famous proclamation in front of the GPO. As opposed to tradition, Pearse did not read the proclamation, as is often reported, from the steps of the GPO, as the General Post Office in Dublin does not have steps leading to its entrance. Some historians have suggested that the document was actually read from the base of Nelson's Pillar. Others have claimed it was Thomas Clarke who proclaimed the Republic and not Pearse at all. But we have stuck to the traditional telling. Episode 2, Easter Monday morning.
This is the news on this Easter Monday morning, 1916. Despite yesterday's orders from Irish Volunteer Chief of Staff Owen McNeill for all volunteers to stand down, crowds of up to 1,250 volunteers and about 200 members of Cumann na mBan have been gathering all morning throughout Dublin. Most are in uniform and many are carrying guns. Similar gatherings have been taking place in Dundalk and Galway. Tensions are higher in the country. This man says he and his family were removed from Stephen's Green at Bayonet Point.
Me and the wife took the kids out for the bank holiday. You know, to feed the ducks and have an early picnic down in the green. But those yobos came marching in their stupid uniforms and started shouting for everyone to get out and go around pointing their damn bayonets at us. To be sure, they meant business, you know. So me and the family got out of there as quick as we could. The wife's more worried about leaving the good blanket behind on the grass, but these fellas meant business. So we're going to see if we can get ice cream and be damned to the blanket.
Colm O'Robards is on the scene in Dublin.
I'm outside the GPO at the moment, where a group of nationalist leaders are gathering at the top of the steps. A large crowd throng the street. It looks like the leaders are preparing to make an announcement, though the crowd appears more derisive than supportive. Reports just in that the volunteers are on the move in Dublin. They've taken over a number of prominent buildings in the city. The General Post Office, the massive Jacobs factory, the forecourts and Boland's Mills, as well as the Mendicity building, where the homeless staying there have been forced out onto the street. Attempts appear to have been made on Dublin Castle by members of the Irish Citizen Army, though they were unable to gain entry. A policeman has been shot dead outside the castle's main gate. It seems events today are part of a full-scale rebellion against the Crown. One of the leaders is about to speak. It's spokesman for the IRB and the Irish Volunteers, Padraig Pearse.
Provisional Government of the Irish Republic to the people of Ireland, Irish men and Irish women. In the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies, to be sovereign and indefeasible. The long usurpation of that right by a foreign people and government has not extinguished the right, nor can it ever be extinguished, except by the destruction of the Irish people.
There you have it. The proclamation has declared Ireland an independent republic. It really is a full-scale rebellion against the Crown. The crowd listening are having none of it, however, and are hurling taunts and insults at the men. A singular morning. Owen, back to you.
Thanks, Colm. A successful raid has taken place in Phoenix Park, the goal being the magazine fort to bolster the rebel supply of weapons. A number of guns and ammunition have been taken by the Republican Special Force, while reports of sightings of 2 flags over the GPO, one bearing the legend Republic, while the other is made up of 3 colours, green, white and orange. Our Southeastern political correspondent Mary Hicks explains what this could mean.
The tricolour is a display of unity between the nation's traditions. It's not new but has been around since 1848, a gift from a group of French women sympathetic to the Irish cause to Thomas Francis Meagher, the leader of Young Irelanders in the 1848 rebellion. He, of course, was sent to Van Diemen's Land for his part. The green represents republicanism from the 1790s, the time of the Society of United Irishmen. The orange is for King William III and his supporters. The flag is an attempt to reconcile the Orange Order with the Irish independence movement because, of course, as with many flags around the world, the white in the centre is to represent peace between the two.
A group of mounted messengers have set out to inform the huge section of the British military enjoying their bank holiday Monday at the Ferryhouse racetrack in order to support the painfully thin on the ground soldiers still stationed in Dublin. In Laois, a train was derailed at Coltwood near Abbeyleix. There have been no reports of injuries. Rail employees and RIC officers were travelling to the area to investigate suspicious activity on the line last night, where rail worker William Dalton had been shot at while in the area. Mr. Dalton was not injured. It appears a group of Irish volunteers destroyed a section of line to prevent British troops reaching Dublin via Waterford. With news on volunteer movements elsewhere in the country, from our studios in Kerry, here's Stacey O'Keefe.
Volunteers who had gathered for manoeuvres in Tipperary and Clare have now obeyed the orders from Owen MacNeill and have dispersed, though individuals and some companies in Clare have remained mobilised. It would seem, however, calls to volunteers in Leitrim, Cavan and Westmeath went unanswered, but reports of movement in Galway and Dundalk have been trickling in. There's confusion in Limerick as dispatches from Pearse to carry out orders are obsolete as the orders rely on the distribution of arms from the recently sunk Odd and then suitably armed to march on Dublin.
And finally in weather. As forecast, Dublin on the east coast is unusually fair, while weather in Cork and elsewhere is being described as atrocious. And that's your news for this Easter Monday morning, the 24th of April, 1916.
As you've heard, there was a lot of confusion surrounding orders given to the various groups of volunteers. This undoubtedly counted for the small turnout in Dublin and lack of concrete events elsewhere in the country. Without modern communications, it was impossible to relay events and orders nationwide with any kind of efficiency. This led to confusing orders, such as Pearse commanding that the Shannon be held, but without arms it was a lost cause. The necessity for secrecy also caused problems, as the only people aware of the plans were those high up in leadership, and those that were turning up for manoeuvres had no idea they were being made part of something bigger, and so went home thinking nothing was amiss. However, those that stayed on did what they could to take part. Some, seeing that there was nothing to be done locally, made their way to Dublin to take part in the fighting. Some travelling all the way from Cork. Others making their way from Belfast via County Tyrone. Episode 3, Easter Monday evening.
This is your news on this Easter Monday afternoon, 1916. Violence since the events of this morning has escalated to full-scale war on the streets of Dublin. A number of non-military personnel have been killed. A second policeman has been shot by rebels, this time at Stephen's Green, which is still firmly held in the hands of the insurrection. A nurse was shot by a British private during a shootout in a hospital while patients cowered by their beds. And a man trying to remove his dray cart from a volunteer barricade was shot after a number of warning shots were fired above his head. Fierce fighting between the Irish volunteers and the British military has been raging all day, on the streets and through buildings. Many of the military men are locals who have been convalescing from their spate of action on the Western Front. some of which are finding the return to combat particularly distressing, perhaps in part due to the fight being right on their own doorstep. British soldiers still stationed in Dublin have had their efforts aided by locals who've been hurling both abuse and stones at the rebels who've been causing all the disruption. Though some have been taking advantage of the disturbance to go looting, something which the volunteers have been taking pains to halt, sometimes resorting to firing over their heads. There's also been chaos at the races, where most of the stationed military have been spending the bank holiday. Colma Robard was covering the racing action this morning and has witnessed the pandemonium firsthand.
That's right, Owen. Here at Fairyhouse it's been unbelievable. The soldiers, whiling away their free day, had a rude shock when mounted messengers rode into Ratoath with news of the events in Dublin. The military immediately sprang into action and began commandeering vehicles of all sorts, as well as all available trains, in a desperate attempt to join in the fray and relieve their overwhelmed comrades. An action which has left many a traveller stranded far from home, some, like this man, as distant as County Clare.
I come up to the races every year. It takes me a full day up and a full day getting back, and that's on the train. But they left me with nothing. The ticket's bought for the return journey, but I have nothing left to be paying for transport or a bed. So until the trains are back on, I suppose I'm on foot. They didn't tell us anything about what all the hurry was. Some of the folks who've been left stranded are saying there's fighting in Dublin. But what do I care about a spot of trouble in that city? I just need to get home.
Sources are reporting that key support points in the city have been taken and held by the volunteers. Among the strategic positions are rail stations, bridges, shops and residences. City Hall is now occupied by their forces, where bloody scenes of violence have been played out. Troops had attempted to rush the main door but were cut down from all sides as supporting positions inflicted great damage to the attackers. All areas held by the rebels are seeing action. British cavalry transporting ammunition have been driven from the forecourts. The Royal Dublin Fusiliers have been exchanging fire with those holding the Mendicity building, and there's been slaughter on Sackville Street as Lancers were cut down in a hail of fire from the GPO. Reports are suggesting that British Army headquarters may be under attack from machine gun fire from the top of Kilmainham Royal Hospital, and the fighting continues to spread.
Dublin is not the only place to see insurgent action today. There have been reports of rebel activity in virtually all quarters. In Galway, volunteers have been busy barricading roads and hoarding supplies. There are reports of over 1,000 volunteers mobilised in the area. Groups of scouts have been sent out to all incoming roads to keep an eye on the movements of the British. Despite the lack of weapons that were to be sent to the area from the Odd, it looks like Galway has every intention in following its orders to hold the Shannon and restrict the movements of the military in the region. In Dundalk, the town clerk, Matt Comerford, has handed all arms held by the national volunteers to the authorities to keep them out of the hands of the Irish volunteers who have set up roadblocks around Ardee and have taken a number of RIC prisoners. Noreen McCartney is in Castlebellingham.
A further discomfort has been imposed on people returning from Fairyhouse to the area. Those travelling by motorcar found their vehicles commandeered to allow the volunteers to move more speedily to Castlebellingham. The volunteers, under the leadership of Dan O'Hannigan, have since taken over the RIC barracks there and intercepted dispatches on their way to Dundalk from Dublin. Reports are that the inconvenienced racegoers were accommodated to their destination on horse and cart by the volunteers, who were at pains to keep the good graces of the locals. In further news from the Dundalk area, a deaf man unable to hear the order to halt that was shouted by volunteers was shot dead in Lurgan Green. The man has been named locally as Andy McGuinness.
In Cork, there have been concerted efforts to avoid bloodshed. Connie Feely is by the Lee.
Cork's volunteer leaders Terence McSweeney and Tomás McCurtain have prepared Volunteer Hall to stand up against assault and have been visited by Assistant Bishop of Cork Dr Collin and the Lord Mayor of Cork Councillor Butterfield, who have entreated with the men to ensure Cork does not suffer violence. I spoke to Dr Collin earlier and he had this to say.
Rumours in Cork are that there's going to be a rising in the city during the night. The Lord Mayor called to me and suggested that we should visit the volunteers and counsel peace. We were assured there would be no offensive on the part of the volunteers, and that such a thing was not contemplated. A purely defensive action was to be undertaken.
So assurances have been given that Cork will be ready to defend any military action against the local volunteers, but no aggression will be sought. There has been widespread speculation that yesterday's long march to Macroom was part of a failed volunteer plan to continue the military action of the Dublin volunteers here in Cork, but the confusing orders from GHQ caused the men to disperse, hindering whatever plans were to be enacted.
Dublin remains in darkness as the rebels have taken the gasworks and the dangerously illuminating street lamps have been left dark. And finally, we apologise as there is no weather forecast available for tomorrow. There has been no communication from the Meteorological Office. That is your news for this Easter Monday, the 24th of April, 1916.
The story of the deaf man being shot dead in Lurgan Green by volunteers was just one of two similar stories, although the other occurred in Phibsborough in Dublin, and it was a British soldier who shot him when he failed to obey the order to halt. It's unclear whether these were two separate incidents or a confused retelling of the same unfortunate event. On Tuesday, the 25th of April, fighting in Dublin settled into a fierce back and forth between the rebels and the British military. A military that, it is easily forgotten, was made up of a large portion of Irish conscripts. The arrival of General Lowe from the Curragh meant a localised command of the troops. Episode 4, Tuesday the 25th.
This is your news on Tuesday the 25th of April, 1916. The early hours of the morning have seen terrible devastation hit Dublin City. Since around 4 a.m, Stephen's Green has been under steady fire from the Shelburne Hotel, where every window seems to be occupied by the military, where a heavy machine gun incessantly sends deadly hail at the rebels. This has forced them to retreat under heavy fire to the College of Surgeons, which now has the attention of the machine gunner. Rebels return rifle fire from the roof. City Hall has been recaptured from the hands of the citizen army, with many prisoners now in custody. At first, the women present were regarded as non-combatants, as nurses and medical support. However, with the truth revealed that the ladies had taken an active part in the fighting, they were escorted to Kilmainham with the rest of the captured. The towers of the rebel-held Jacobs factory, under Thomas MacDonagh, John McBride and Michael Hanrahan, have become sniper nests which have turned their fire on the recently relinquished City Hall. Colm O'Robarde has more.
Between the military and the insurgents, much ground is being lost and gained, with neither side gaining the upper hand. Bodies of men and horses litter the street, and the casual and curious bystander of yesterday is nowhere to be seen. In an attempt to dislodge the rebels, the military have engaged the use of 18-pound artillery at North Circular Road. Seamus Galvin is with the Irish Volunteers.
Once we were told by the officers what the plan was, that we were rising up, we knew that they'd have heavy guns out on us eventually. They are an empire after all. We just need to hold on and take them down. But there's not going to be a window left in Dublin at this rate. Just listen to the noise of that thing.
Well-known Irish writer, radical activist and pacifist Francis Sheehy Skeffington has been arrested. He was returning from a meeting he had called trying to organise a citizen police in order to stop the looting in the area. While under arrest, an officer of the 3rd Battalion of Royal Irish Rifles, Captain J.C. Bowen Colthurst, took Sheehy Skeffington with his hands tied behind his back as a hostage and human shield in a raiding party. During the excursion, a number of men were threatened and 2 pedestrians were shot, a 19-year-old mechanic and a 40-year-old bricklayer. The raiding party went on to destroy a shop with hand grenades. They also captured 2 people who'd taken refuge in the shop, Thomas Dixon and Patrick McIntyre, both pro-British journalists. In Galway, RIC barracks have been attacked in Clanbridge and in Oranmore. Stacey O'Keefe has more.
The attacks were perpetrated by 2 separate Irish volunteer groups armed with only a few guns and pitchforks and other such implements. In light of the failed attempts, the groups have joined forces to make another attack on the Oranmore barracks, but the RIC had barricaded themselves in tightly and the forces led by Liam Mellows were unable to take the building. As reinforcements of military and police arrived by train, the men have moved off toward the Agricultural College near Athenry with a group of RIC prisoners in tow. Volunteers from Carnmore and Clare Galway have gathered in the Carnmore area and have come under fire. Captain Brian Malloy ordered his volunteers to return fire, and soon after calls by the RIC for the men to surrender, Constable Patrick Whelan was shot and fatally wounded. The 2 sides eventually parted, the RIC turning towards Galway and the rebels to the Agricultural College in Oranmore, which is quickly becoming their headquarters. That's all for now, Owen. Back to you.
Louth has seen some movement today as a group known as the Home Defence Corps, who are armed by the military, have been guarding bridges and roads leading into the town of Dundalk. While in the town itself, attempts have been made by the military to seize a local business's motorcar.
We had gotten repeated orders to leave the car with them, which we were in no way going to do, but we had a feeling they were going to come for the Peugeot, so we took out the carburettor so they couldn't use it. But the gits, well, they were determined not to leave us with it, so they took one of our horses and his harness and used him to take the motorcar to the barracks. I don't know if we're going to get it back, even when all this is over, should they never take much notice of us.
There has also been unconfirmed rumours that an RIC officer, Constable McGee, was shot on the street of Castle Bellingham. In Tipperary, Michael O'Callaghan, a trade union activist and a member of various Republican organisations, was taunted by some family members of British Army men. O'Callaghan fired a shot that wounded a teenage boy. A siege then followed at O'Callaghan's home in Tipperary town, but he managed to flee. Back in Dublin, martial law has been declared and the military await reinforcements. A gunboat settled into the Grand Canal dock and began firing salvos at rebel positions at Boland's Mill. This, as word comes in, of two military forces converging on the fighting, which has spurred the volunteers into retreating with the intention of boosting the defence of their headquarters in Sackville Street. The sounds of sledgehammers have been heard in the area, suggesting that the insurgent hold on the area is being consolidated by knocking through walls to allow access between buildings. So far, any attempt to dislodge them from their stronghold has been costly to the military. The infant technology of wireless communication has been used unusually by the rebels. Where normally signals are targeted by experts to particular receiving stations, the rebels, sent by Commandant Plunkett, have used the equipment in the occupied Dublin Wireless School of Telegraphy to send a signal into the ether in the hopes that someone might pick it up. The message in Morse code says, "Irish Republic declared in Dublin today. Irish troops have captured city and are in full possession. Enemy cannot move in city, the whole country rising." It appears that this is the first time that such telegraphy equipment has been used in this way. Once again, there is no weather to report. It would appear that the meteorological office is closed due to the disturbances in Dublin. And that's your news for this Tuesday the 25th of April 1916.
The lack of a weather report is not simply a dramatic device, but a real occurrence, as the meteorological office was based in central Dublin and really was affected by the fighting. When Ireland gained its independence, many street and town names were changed. Two major changes that affect our understanding of these news reports are Kingstown and Sackville Street. Kingstown Harbour was renamed Dunleera in 1920 and Sackville Street had its name changed in 1924 to O'Connell Street. Episode 5, Wednesday 26th.
This is your news on Wednesday the 26th of April 1916. Two ships carrying troops, the SS Tynwald and the SS Patriotic, have arrived at County Dublin's Kingstown Harbour, where several thousand soldiers have begun disembarking in the early hours of this morning. Despite the hour, hundreds of Dubliners have come out to view the pageant. This soldier says some of the troops are confused as to why they've arrived in Ireland and not on the beaches of France.
Well, you does as you're told, right? They give us half the training and sends us off to fight the Hun like all the rest. Yes? No, they send us here, but no one's told us we've ended up in Ireland. Some of the lads I've been training with are from here. We're not at war. The government think you've got some Germans hidden under the shamrock or something.
The recently arrived reinforcements are marching into Dublin and more troop ships are expected. This morning, Captain J.C. Bowen Colthurst ordered his prisoners who were apprehended last night shot. This despite the fact that the two journalists were pro-British and Francis Sheehy Skeffington was a well-known pacifist and was in no way involved with the current trouble. Sources claim the men were unaware of their doom and were taken to a yard and shot without warning. Moves and counter-moves have been evident throughout the morning in Dublin, and Colma Rubard is in the city centre.
A man identified as Enniscorthy's Paul Galligan was spotted cycling out from the GPO in the early hours of the morning, apparently on a mission of some import. Sources claim that he met personally with three of the leaders of the rebellion, James Connolly, Padraig Pearse and Joseph Plunkett, while there. There are no details as yet as to the purpose of Mr. Galligan. Hunger has gripped the city as fighting continues unabated, and reports are that civilians are being caught in the crossfire as they venture out in search of food. Artillery continues to pound the city and a gunboat has destroyed Liberty Hall after several hours shelling. both casualties and reinforcements are growing on either side. Earlier, the Dublin Fusiliers put pressure on the rebels at the Mendicity building. This eyewitness describes what happened.
The Fusiliers had an awful time of it. They weren't able to make any inroads against the rebels at all. Seems like they were getting really frustrated under all the rifle fire that was keeping them pinned down, because they started to lob hand grenades through the windows. But the lads inside just picked them up and threw them back at them. They gave the Fusiliers some shock, I can tell you. They called off the attack for a bit to collect their wits, I'd say, but it wasn't long before they were at it again.
Entrenched rebels at 25 Northumberland Road have been the centre of much of today's activity. As a prime position for ambush, they have been successful in fighting off British forces as they've tried again and again to rout the rebels. A mercy ceasefire was called to allow medical staff to attend the wounded. However, British troops attempted to gain ground during the distraction, but were spotted by the insurgents stationed at Mount Street Bridge. By evening, though, explosives were used to blow the door off the house, and troops stormed inside, finding that just 2 men had held off their forces throughout the day. Meanwhile, the Mendicity building has been captured by the Dublin Fusiliers, and Captain Sean Houston and his men have been taken prisoner, though it seems that after they were arrested, one of the volunteers was shot dead. With the takeover of the Mendicity completed, British attention has turned to the forecourts where fighting has intensified. As the fighting continued all over the city, there was a brief ceasefire in Stephen's Green just before noon, as the park's caretaker bravely and calmly left the relative safety of his lodge and walked to the duck pond to feed all but forgotten birds. I'm here with the caretaker now. Sir, why would you put yourself in danger like that? Since the beginning of the insurgents, this whole area has been subject to intense fighting. Were you not afraid of being caught in the crossfire?
Well, it's my job. I couldn't have someone say I neglected my charges because of a bit of danger. I look after the park and the creatures in it. Duty called and I answered. It's been a few days and it didn't look like this nonsense was going to stop any time soon, so I did what some may claim was foolish. But I did my duty, and that's all there is to it.
There you have it, Owen. Duty to the vulnerable. Back to you.
Thanks, Colin. Other areas of the country have also seen some activity today. In Galway, the HMS Gloucester has arrived in Galway Bay and begun shelling the Athenry area. The warship also brought reinforcements to the tune of 200 Royal Marines to the local military. Athenry RIC attacked the rebel headquarters at the Agricultural College, but were repulsed. Their action, however, impressed on leader Liam Mellows the vulnerability of their position, and plans were made to move their company to Moyode Castle, which would also move volunteers out of the range of shells from the HMS Gloucester. Members of Cumann na mBan have been going through the area asking for bread to be baked for the volunteers. A short exchange of fire was had between another supply expedition force and the RIC. In Tipperary, Michael Callan, who was on the run for the shooting and wounding of a teenager yesterday, was discovered at his cousin's house in the Kilross area, where an altercation took place between him, a police constable Hurley and a Sergeant O'Rourke, which culminated in the shooting dead of both RIC men. O'Callaghan remains at large. Dundalk has been completely cut off by agents of the military in an attempt to smother any assistance to the rebels, and tension is building in the town. Captain Bowen Colthurst, responsible for the execution of Mr. Sheehy Skeffington, Dixon and McIntyre, and accused of the shooting dead of a number of unarmed pedestrians, including 2 children, has been removed from duty and confined to barracks by Major Francis Fletcher Vane. The British have gained many victories today in Dublin, but have paid dearly for them. Claims being that the addition of the gunship the Helga on the Liffey has made a significant difference. Shocked troops have begun to retire for the night, but in their ears ring the gratitude of the locals for having saved them from the insurgents who had insinuated themselves into their quiet neighbourhoods. Still no weather report from the Meteorological Office. And that is your news for this Wednesday the 26th of April, 1916.
The murders of Francis Sheehy Skeffington and others by J.C. Bowen Colthurst, born in Dripsey Castle, were ignored by his commanding officer and his peers. It was only on the return of Sir Francis Fletcher Vane, who had been on leave in Bray, that action was taken. So outraged was he that directly after the rising he obtained leave and arranged an interview with British Prime Minister Asquith and Secretary of State for War Field Marshal Kitchener, demanding that action be taken and threatening to go public if Bowen Colthurst was not court-martialled. He was eventually tried and found guilty but insane. For his part, Sir Fletcher Vane was dismissed from the army and was denied reinstatement despite repeated appeals. Even appealing to the king failed. Released from Broadmoor Criminal Mental Asylum in 1922, Bowen Colthurst spent the rest of his days hunted by the IRA and died in British Columbia in 1966. We pause here, with hunger beginning to grip both the volunteers in Dublin and elsewhere in the country, and local Dubliners who are being forced to take serious risks in order to feed their families. Fighting is fierce, but yet stalemate reigns.